The ghost in the machine had a name. It was Jake. He haunted the skeletal remains of his family's Montana farm, a forgotten place for a forgotten man. The wind, a bitter November predator, clawed at the peeling paint of the clapboard house, its howl a familiar chorus to the high-pitched whine that lived permanently inside his skull. Tinnitus, the doctors had called it, a souvenir from the IED that had vaporized his team, his career, and his soul in a flash of Kandahar dust. He was a former Navy SEAL, a creature forged in the crucible of salt water and blood, now reduced to this. A man adrift in a sea of silence, anchored only by the weight of the ghosts on his back. Miller, Santos, Doc, Evans. Their faces flickered behind his eyes with every sip of the cheap whiskey that served as his breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The farm was a perfect mirror of his own decay. The barn sagged, its spine broken by decades of heavy snow and heavier neglect. Fences lay in tangled heaps of rust and splintered wood, like the mangled shrapnel still nesting deep in his left thigh. Every step was a grinding reminder of the day the world had ended. He moved through the rooms of the old house like a phantom, his presence marked only by the empty bottles and the faint, acrid smell of stale regret. His father had died 6 months ago, leaving him this graveyard of memories. He hadn't been back in over a decade, not since enlisting to escape the suffocating quiet of the valley. Now the quiet was all he had, and it was louder than any firefight. It screamed with the words he could never say, the apologies he could never make. He was cleaning out his father's old roll-top desk, a task he'd been avoiding for weeks. It felt like an archaeological dig into a life he'd barely known. Robert Carter had been a man of few words, a Vietnam vet who had buried his own war so deep it had turned him to stone. Jake found the usual things, old tax returns, a faded photo of his mother, a handful of medals that felt cold and meaningless in his hand. Then he found the drawer. It was stuck, jammed shut by time or humidity. He pried it open with the tip of his KA bar, the wood groaning in protest. Inside, nestled in a bed of yellowed cheesecloth, was a single object, a dog collar. It was thick, military-grade leather, worn and cracked with age, but clearly well cared for. A heavy brass nameplate was riveted to it. Jake picked it up. The weight was substantial. He ran a thumb over the engraving, his fingers tracing the letters, feeling the ghosts of another time. Kaiser. Below the name, a unit designation and a handler's name. Sergeant Robert Carter. Jake froze. His breath hitched in his chest. His father. But his father never had a dog. Not once in Jake's entire life had there been an animal on this farm, let alone a German shepherd big enough to wear a collar like this. It was a phantom piece of a past he couldn't access, a story his father had taken to the grave. He placed the collar on the desk, the brass catching the weak afternoon light, a silent, confusing testament to a man he thought he knew. He stared out the window as the sky began to bruise, turning a deep, angry purple. A storm was coming, another one. He welcomed it. The violence of the weather was a comfort, a familiar chaos that drowned out the silence for a little while. He closed the drawer, leaving the mystery of the collar to sit in the growing darkness. That night, the storm hit with biblical fury. Rain lashed against the windows like thrown gravel, and the wind shrieked like a dying animal. Jake sat in his father's worn armchair, the whiskey bottle his only companion, listening to the house groan around him. He was halfway to oblivion when he heard it. A sound. It was thin, almost imperceptible beneath the gale's roar. A high-pitched whimper. He tilted his head, the tinnitus screaming in his ear. He dismissed it. The wind played tricks. The old house was full of groans and sighs. It was nothing. He took another swallow of whiskey, the burn a welcome distraction. There it was again. Closer this time. Desperate. It wasn't the wind. It was life. Something was out there, suffering. A familiar, dormant instinct stirred in his gut, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the blast, the instinct to act. He set the bottle down with a heavy thud, cursing himself, the storm, and whatever damn creature was pulling him from his stupor. He grabbed a heavy mag light from the mantel and shrugged on his old field jacket. He paused at the door, his hand hovering over the lock, then turned back. He retrieved his Sig Sauer from the nightstand, the cold, familiar weight of it in his hand, a grim comfort. He didn't know why. He just knew he wasn't going out there unarmed. The rain was a physical blow, icy and relentless. It plastered his hair to his skull in seconds. The flashlight beam cut a shaky tunnel through the maelstrom, illuminating a world of thrashing branches and churning mud. He followed the sound, his limp more pronounced on the slick, uneven ground. It led him toward the collapsed section of the old barn, a gaping maw of splintered timbers and rusted metal. The whimpering was louder now, punctuated by a low, threatening growl. He swept the light across the wreckage, and then he saw it. Huddled in a small pocket of debris was a German shepherd. It was a skeleton draped in muddy, matted fur. One of its hind legs was trapped, pinned viciously between a fallen roof beam and a piece of rusted-out harrowing equipment. Its ribs were starkly visible, its body trembling uncontrollably from cold, pain, and fear. But it was the eyes that stopped him cold. When the beam hit them, they glowed with a feral, defiant fire. They were filled with pain, yes, but also with a cornered rage that Jake knew intimately. It was the look of a warrior who refused to surrender, even when the battle was lost. It was the same haunted, hollowed-out expression he saw staring back from his own reflection every god-forsaken morning. He saw his own brokenness in that animal, his own will to endure, even when endurance felt like a curse. In that instant, in the heart of the storm, the ghost in the machine felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a connection, a purpose. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, lowering the flashlight to avoid blinding the terrified animal. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Easy. I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog responded with a weak snarl, its lips pulling back to reveal pale gums and worn teeth. It was trying to be threatening, but it was a bluff. All its energy was focused on survival. Jake stopped. He knew this dance. He'd seen it in the eyes of young recruits facing their first firefight. He'd seen it in his own reflection. It was the language of trauma. He holstered his pistol, showing his empty hands. He knelt in the mud, the cold water soaking through his jeans, ignoring the sharp protest from his injured leg. He stayed there for a long time, just letting the dog get used to his presence, speaking in a low, steady monotone. He didn't talk about the weather or the farm. He talked about his team. He listed their names, their hometowns, the stupid jokes they used to tell. He spoke to the dog as if it were one of his men, a fallen soldier he was trying to bring home. Slowly, agonizingly, the growling subsided, replaced by a soft, exhausted whimper. The dog's head lowered slightly, its ears twitching at his words. It was listening. As he prepared to assess the trap, the night was shattered by another sound. The rumble of an approaching engine and the harsh glare of headlights cutting through the rain. A beat-up Ford pickup skidded to a halt in the mud, its engine sputtering. A man climbed out, slamming the door. He was large and slovenly, with a beer gut straining the fabric of a stained flannel shirt. The reek of stale beer and wet cigarettes hit Jake even through the downpour. "What the hell you think you're doing with my dog?" the man bellowed, his voice a gravelly slur. He brandished a tire iron, its metal glinting menacingly in his headlights. This was Earl, a local piece of trash known for running a squalid backyard breeding operation, whispered to be a front for something uglier: dog fighting. Jake rose slowly to his feet, placing himself between Earl and the trapped animal. He didn't say a word. The rain ran in rivulets down his face, dripping from the hard line of his jaw. "I said, that's my property," Earl repeated, taking a clumsy step forward. "Cost me good money, that one. Now step aside before I make you." The part of Jake that was a civilian, the part that was supposed to de-escalate, was dead and buried. What rose in its place was the seal, the predator. All the numbness, all the grief, coalesced into a single point of cold, crystalline focus. He moved. It wasn't fast, not with his leg. It was efficient. A single fluid motion that was both beautiful and terrifying in its economy. He closed the distance in 2 steps. His left hand shot out, not to block the tire iron, but to grip Earl's wrist. His thumb found the pressure point, the radial nerve. He squeezed. Earl's eyes widened in shock and pain. A choked gasp escaped his lips. The tire iron clattered into the mud. Jake didn't release the pressure. He leaned in close, his face inches from the other man's, his voice a low, chilling whisper that cut through the storm's howl. This dog isn't your property anymore. There was no anger in his voice, no heat. There was something far worse. An absolute void. The sound of a man who had walked through hell and was perfectly willing to drag someone else back there with him. You're going to get in your truck, Jake continued, his grip tightening, making Earl cry out. You're going to drive away, and you are never, ever going to come back to this farm. You're never going to look for this dog. If I see your face again, if I even hear your name in this valley, I will find you. Do you understand me? Terror, pure and undiluted, washed over Earl's face. He was a bully, a coward who preyed on the weak. He had just come face to face with something that was not weak. He nodded frantically, sweat and rain mixing on his pale face. Jake released him. He shoved him backward, and Earl stumbled, falling into the mud. He scrambled up, his bravado gone, and fled back to his truck like a kicked cur. The engine roared to life, tires spinning and spraying mud everywhere, and then he was gone, his taillights vanishing into the torrential rain. Silence returned, broken only by the storm and the dog's soft whimpers. Jake turned back to the animal. "All right, soldier," he said, his voice softening. "Let's get you out of here." It took him nearly an hour. He used a crowbar from the barn, his muscles screaming in protest, his bad leg a riot of agony. He worked with a surgeon's focus, leveraging the heavy beam, millimeter by millimeter, talking to the dog the entire time. "Hold on, just a little more. We're almost there. You're a fighter. I can see it." Finally, with a groan of tortured metal, the beam shifted enough. The dog's leg was free. It was a mangled, bloody mess, clearly broken. The animal tried to stand, then collapsed with a cry of pain. Gently, Jake scooped the dog into his arms. It was shockingly light, nothing but bone and fur. The dog tensed for a moment, then went limp, surrendering to his care. It rested its head against his chest, a gesture of absolute trust that struck Jake with the force of a physical blow. He carried his new charge through the mud and rain, back to the warmth and light of the farmhouse. He had gone out into the storm, a ghost. He came back a guardian. Inside, he laid the dog on a pile of old blankets by the hearth. The fireplace was cold, but it was the warmest spot in the house. He worked by the light of a single lamp, his hands surprisingly steady. He cleaned the wound as best he could, flushing it with warm water and antiseptic from a dusty first aid kit. The leg was bad, the bone was shattered. It would need a vet, and soon. As he gently cleaned the grime from the dog's coat, he noticed it, a smudge of dark ink deep inside its right ear. He carefully wiped away the mud. It wasn't a smudge. It was a tattoo, faded but still legible, a series of letters and numbers, a military marking. Jake's blood ran cold. This wasn't just some stray Earl had picked up. This was a military working dog, a fellow veteran, a soldier abandoned behind enemy lines. A jolt of righteous fury, hot and clean, burned through the fog of his apathy. This changed everything. He finished cleaning the dog, wrapping its leg in a crude splint. The animal was exhausted, its eyes fluttering shut. Jake found a bowl, filled it with water, and held it to the dog's snout. It drank weakly at first, then with a desperate thirst. He had no dog food, so he opened a can of tuna, mashing it with a fork. The dog devoured it in seconds. With the animal resting, a new, urgent energy propelled Jake. The discovery of the tattoo had ignited a spark in the ashes of his soul. He went back to his father's desk, the mystery of the collar now intertwined with the mystery of the dog in his living room. He sat down, turning the heavy leather over in his hands. Kaiser, Sergeant Robert Carter. He booted up his old, slow laptop, the dial-up connection screaming in protest. He navigated to a database he hadn't accessed in years, a network for MWD handlers and veterans. He entered the tattoo number. The screen blinked. A profile appeared. MWDIDX357. Name, Kaiser. Breed, German Shepherd. Status, MIA, presumed KIA. Incident date August 14th, 2018. Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. It was the same day, the same province, the same incident. He scrolled down to the handler information, his finger trembling. Handler, Sergeant David Miller. Status, KIA. The air left Jake's lungs in a rush. Miller, Davy Miller. The kid from Ohio who could quote Shakespeare and field strip a rifle in under a minute. The kid who had been standing 2 feet to his left when the world exploded. He had been Kaiser's handler. This dog had been there. It had survived the same blast that had killed its handler and the rest of Jake's team. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. The room tilted. The ghosts were no longer just in his head. One of them was lying on a blanket by his fireplace. How? How did Miller's dog, a dog lost in the mountains of Afghanistan, end up tortured in a barn in Montana? And the collar. Why did his father have a collar with the same name? The questions spun in his head, a vortex of impossibility and grief. He looked from the collar in his hand to the sleeping dog. 2 Kaisers, 2 soldiers, 2 generations of war, somehow connected in this derelict farmhouse. It was too much to be a coincidence. It was a message from the dead. He spent the rest of the night watching the dog, whose name was now a sacred thing. Kaiser. He watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, a small, miraculous rhythm in the suffocating silence of the house. For the first time in years, Jake Carter was not alone, and for the first time in years, he was terrified of the morning. Morning came not with sunlight, but with the flat, gray light of a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of broken branches and standing water. Jake hadn't slept. He'd found some ground beef in the freezer and cooked it for Kaiser, who ate with a quiet dignity. The dog needed a real doctor. The nearest vet was in a town 40 miles away. As he was looking up the number, he saw it. A black SUV, sleek and out of place against the rustic poverty of the valley, was making its way slowly up his long, rutted driveway. It wasn't a local vehicle. It wasn't friendly. The dormant tactical part of his brain took over instantly. Threat assessment. 2 occupants, male. They moved with a disciplined economy that screamed military or contractor. They parked 30 yards from the house, a clear tactical choice, giving them a wide field of fire. Jake moved to the window, peering through the grimy glass. Kaiser, sensing the shift in his demeanor, lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered, placing a hand on the dog's head. The men got out. They wore expensive outdoor gear that looked brand new, a poor attempt at blending in. One was tall and lean, the clear leader. The other was built like a refrigerator. They weren't here to ask for directions. Jake met them on the porch, his Sig Sauer tucked into the small of his back. He stood with his weight on his good leg, a posture that looked casual but was coiled for action. "Can I help you?" His voice was flat, devoid of warmth. The leader gave him a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Carter, my name is Shaw. We're with a private security firm. We're here to recover some misplaced assets." "I don't have anything for you," Jake said. Shaw's smile tightened. "We have reason to believe you're in possession of a highly valuable piece of government property, a German Shepherd. We'd like to retrieve it, quietly." "This is my property," Jake said, his gaze unwavering. "You need to leave." "I don't think you understand," Shaw said, taking a step onto the porch. His partner fanned out to the side, a classic flanking maneuver. "That animal is part of a DARPA program. It's not a pet, it's a weapon, and it's coming with us." The lie was almost perfect. DARPA was plausible. But Jake had seen Kaiser's file. He was a standard MWD. These men were cleaners, sent to bury a loose end. And that loose end was the dog who had survived the blast. "Last chance," Jake said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Get off my land." Shaw sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "Have it your way." He moved with blinding speed, but Jake was faster. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and violence. Shaw's hand went for a weapon under his jacket. Jake's hand was already on his Sig. He didn't draw. Instead, he lunged forward, using his body as a battering ram, slamming Shaw back against the porch railing. The wood splintered with a sharp crack. The second man, the refrigerator, charged from the side. Jake pivoted, letting the man's momentum carry him past, and drove his elbow hard into the man's kidney. The big man grunted, his breath exploding from his lungs. The war had come home. The quiet farmhouse was now a kill zone. Jake shoved Shaw off the porch and scrambled back inside, slamming and bolting the heavy oak door just as the first bullet splintered the wood next to his head. The sound was like a distant sniper rifle, a sound he knew all too well. He moved through the house like a wraith, his limp, forgotten adrenaline singing through his veins. This was his terrain. He knew every creaking floorboard, every loose window frame. Kaiser was barking, a deep, furious sound that was no longer weak. He was on his feet, standing guard despite his broken leg, his body a shield between the door and Jake. "With me, boy," Jake commanded. The dog obeyed instantly, limping after him as Jake moved toward the back of the house. Another volley of shots tore through the front windows, shattering glass and peppering the far wall with plaster. These men weren't trying to scare him. They were here to kill him and take the dog. He set up a position in the kitchen, which offered the best cover and a clear line of sight to the back door. He could hear them moving outside, communicating in low, professional tones. They were splitting up, preparing to breach from two directions. Amateurs. He waited. The silence stretched, thick and tense. It was the silence before the storm, the breath before the plunge. He felt a strange sense of calm. The ghost was gone. The seal was back. The back door exploded inward, kicked off its hinges. The refrigerator-sized man filled the frame, a suppressed pistol leading the way. Jake fired twice. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space. Two tight holes appeared in the center of the man's chest. He staggered backward, a look of surprise on his face, and collapsed. One down. Shaw shouted from the front of the house, a string of curses. Jake knew he would be coming now, angry and less cautious. He moved from the kitchen to the hall, using the shadows as cover. He heard Shaw enter through the broken front door, his footsteps careful on the glass-strewn floor. "Carter, you're a dead man. You have no idea what you're involved in." Jake remained silent, a predator preparing an ambush. He flattened himself against the wall at the end of the hall, just out of sight. He could hear Shaw's breathing, hear the soft scrape of his boots. Closer, closer. Just as Shaw stepped into the hallway, Jake prepared to move. But he wasn't the only hunter in the house. From the shadows of the living room, a black and tan blur shot out. Kaiser. Ignoring his shattered leg, he launched himself at Shaw, a guttural snarl ripping from his throat. He hit the man's gun arm with the force of a freight train, sinking his teeth deep into flesh and bone. Shaw screamed, a high-pitched sound of pain and shock. His gun went flying, skittering across the wooden floor. The opening was all Jake needed. He exploded from his position, driving the crown of his head into Shaw's nose with a sickening crunch. The man reeled back, stunned, blood pouring from his face. Jake followed up with a brutal series of strikes, efficient and disabling. A blow to the throat, a knee to the solar plexus. Shaw crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. The fight was over. Jake stood over him, chest heaving, the cig steady in his hand. Kaiser stood guard, growling, his leg bleeding freely onto the floorboards. "You saved my life, boy," Jake whispered, his hand finding the dog's head. He dragged the unconscious bodies outside, away from the house. He was wounded, a deep gash on his arm from flying glass. And Kaiser needed immediate medical attention. He knew more would come. Shaw's firm wouldn't just write off 2 lost men and a multi-million-dollar asset. He found Shaw's satellite phone. He scrolled through the contacts, his mind racing. There was only one person who could fix this, one person who could bring the full weight of the system down on these people. He dialed the number from memory. It rang twice. "Wallace." The voice was gruff, familiar, a relic from his old life. Commander Wallace, his former CO. "Sir, it's Carter. Jake Carter." There was a pause on the other end. "Jake, son, what's wrong? Where are you?" In clipped, precise sentences, Jake laid it out. The dog, Miller. The men who came for him. the firefight. He left nothing out. They're coming back, sir, and they'll come heavy. Sit tight, son. Wallace's voice was grim, but filled with a new resolve. Don't move. I'm spinning up the QRF. The cavalry is coming. Just hold on. The line went dead. Jake sat on his blood-stained porch, Kaiser resting his head on his good knee. The sun was beginning to climb, casting long shadows across the valley. He looked at the old leather collar he'd slipped into his pocket before the fight. He needed to know. He needed the final piece of the puzzle. He dialed his father's sister, his Aunt Carol, the keeper of the family stories. Jake, is that you? Are you all right? Her voice was frail, worried. I'm fine, Aunt Carol. I have a strange question. Did Dad ever have a dog? A German shepherd named Kaiser? The silence on the other end was heavy, filled with a sorrow that spanned decades. When she finally spoke, her voice was choked with tears. Oh, Jake, your father, he never told you? And then the story came pouring out. His father, Sergeant Robert Carter, was a dog handler in Vietnam. His partner was a shepherd named Kaiser. On a routine patrol, Kaiser alerted to an ambush, a whole company of Viet Cong lying in wait. The dog saved his entire platoon, but he was cut down by machine gun fire in the process. He died in your father's arms. He never forgave himself, Carol whispered. He carried that guilt his whole life. It's why he was so quiet, so distant. He buried that part of himself with his dog. She continued, her voice trembling. When he read about your incident in Afghanistan, about your friend Miller and his dog, a dog with the same name, it broke something open in him. He saw a chance for redemption. He spent the last 2 years of his life, and every cent he had, tracking that dog. He found out Kaiser had been sold on the black market, passed around, eventually ending up with that horrible man, Earl. Your father was too old and sick to get him back himself. He was trying to figure out a way when his heart gave out. He died trying to save a piece of your world, Jake, to bring home a soldier he felt he'd left behind. The puzzle pieces slammed into place, forming a picture of such profound grief and love that it took Jake's breath away. The collar wasn't for the old Kaiser, it was for the new one, a tribute, a promise. Tears streamed down Jake's face, hot and silent. He wept for the father he never knew, for the silent burdens they had both carried, for the impossible, beautiful loyalty of 2 dogs named Kaiser. He looked down at the wounded animal by his side, who licked the tears from his hand. In the distance, he heard it, the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades, growing steadily louder. 2 Blackhawks descended from the sky, landing in the field beside the farmhouse. The ramp dropped, and a team of fully armed SEALs poured out, establishing a perimeter. Commander Wallace strode toward the porch, his face a mask of concern. He took in the scene, the bodies, the shattered windows, Jake bleeding on the steps with the wounded dog. His eyes softened. It's over, son, Wallace said, his voice gentle. The walls Jake had built around his heart for years finally crumbled into dust. The numbness gave way to a tidal wave of grief. It was my fault, sir, he choked out, the words he'd held inside for so long. Miller. The team. I should have seen it. Wallace knelt in front of him, putting a firm hand on his shoulder. No, it wasn't your fault. Sometimes the world just breaks. But you did this. You brought one of our own home. You both came home. 1 year later, the farm was no longer a ghost. New fences stood straight and true. The barn had been repaired, its spine strong again. The house was freshly painted, the windows sparkling in the Montana sun. It was a place of healing, of life. Jake stood in the yard, throwing a tennis ball. His limp was still there, a permanent echo of the past, but his face was different. The haunted, hollowed-out look was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. He smiled as a magnificent, healthy German shepherd bounded after the ball, his movements filled with joy and power. Kaiser's leg had healed with a slight limp of its own, a matching scar for his matching soul. A car pulled up the driveway. Dr. Eris Thorne, the local vet who had saved Kaiser's leg and, in the process, had become a fixture in their lives, got out, a bag of dog treats in her hand. She had listened to his story, seen the bond between man and dog, and had become their first bridge back to the world. "He's looking good, Jake," she said, her smile warm. "We're getting there," Jake replied, scratching Kaiser behind the ears. They stood together, the three of them, watching the sun dip below the mountains. Two broken warriors, a man and a dog, who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death. They had found each other in the storm, and in the ruins of their lives, they had built a new one. They had built a home. They had built a family. The ghost in the machine was finally at peace.